how black male slaves were sexually exploited by white women slave owners. The sexual exploitation and rape of black male slaves by their white female owners remains a largely hidden chapter in history. Even though white supremacists allowed the accounts of black women being exploited to surface, they were reluctant to reveal how white women used black male slaves as objects of lust. These women often brought the enslaved men to their homes in secret, hiding their actions from their husbands. If these stories were widely known, they would challenge the ego of white supremacists, question the loyalty of white women, and bring embarrassment to their families. White women slave owners didn't just engage in sexual abuse, they took exploitation to another level, as we'll explore in this video. Let's begin. Despite societal expectations of femininity, white women of the planter class held considerable power within the institution of slavery. They actively participated in sustaining and enforcing this system, exercising authority over enslaved people, especially black male slaves. It's important to note that prior to the Civil War, white women in the American South couldn't vote or hold public office. Upon marriage, their property technically became their husbands. However, they still had one significant power in common with white men. They could buy, sell, and own enslaved people. In her book, White Women as Slave Owners in the American South, historian Stephanie Jones Rogers argues that white women were far from passive bystanders. Contrary to traditional narratives, they were active participants in slavery, using black slaves to bolster their economic standing. Jones Rogers based her research on interviews with formerly enslaved people, conducted during the Great Depression through the Federal Writers Project. These interviews revealed that young white girls were often raised to be slave owners, learning discipline and mastery over enslaved people from an early age. Black slaves were given to these girls as gifts for birthdays or holidays, sometimes even to infants. One striking example appears in court records, where a woman recalled receiving a black slave from her grandfather when she was just 9 months old. This shows how deeply ingrained the ownership of human beings was. Children were clearly taught to view enslaved individuals as property. This early indoctrination contributed to racist and supremacist beliefs that persisted for generations. One of the most disturbing elements of this abuse was the sexual exploitation of black male slaves by elite white women. While popular narratives often depict white women as innocent or passive during slavery, there were cases where they initiated non-consensual sexual encounters, acts of refusing their position of power over enslaved men. A reference to this abuse appears in Incidents in the Life of a Slave Girl by Harriet Jacobs, herself formerly enslaved. She described how planters' daughters exploited male slaves. White men who themselves raped black women may not have foreseen that their daughters and wives would do the same with black male slaves. While both forms of exploitation were unethical and inhumane, white men often took pride in raping black women. In contrast, the idea that white women were sexually involved with black male slaves was deeply shameful to them. It's crucial to note that these relationships were not consensual. Black male slaves had no choice. Refusing a white woman's sexual demands could lead to brutal beatings or even death. Many chose the lesser evil of exploitation to avoid being murdered. Jacobs wrote of a slaveholder whose reputation was ruined after his daughter gave birth to a child fathered by one of the most abused male slaves on the plantation. She didn't choose a white man or an intelligent house servant. She selected the man she could control most easily and secretly. That in itself is evidence of sexual predation and abuse, not mutual attraction. White mistresses and elite women, like their male counterparts, exercised sexual control over their slaves. Some even threatened to accuse enslaved men of rape if they refused their advances. This tapped into patriarchal norms, portraying white women as weak and in need of protection, thus invoking white male violence and punishment against black men. The motivations behind these acts varied. Some women acted out of boredom or sexual frustration. Others may have subconsciously used these encounters to gain a sense of power in a world where they themselves had limited agency. Despite their privilege, elite white women were essentially the property of their husbands. They had little freedom and were often victims of spousal abuse. Many were isolated and unhappy. Meanwhile, their husbands openly had affairs with or raped enslaved women. Still, none of this justifies their actions. These women used their power to dominate and control others sexually, in a society where they felt powerless themselves. Slavery gave them an outlet for this frustration, but that outlet was one of cruelty and abuse. Sexual violence wasn't the only form of abuse. Physical violence was widespread as well. From rural plantations to urban households, white women were often complicit in violent acts against black men. These ranged from beatings to more horrific punishments, leaving lasting physical and emotional scars. One of the most notorious figures in this history was Madame Marie Delphine LaLaurie of New Orleans. Her name is synonymous with cruelty. She tortured her enslaved black men in horrifying ways, gouging out eyes, drilling holes in skulls, and leaving wounds to fester with maggots. On April 10, 1834, a fire broke out at her mansion. Neighbors rushed to help, but noticed she wasn't calling on her slaves for assistance unusual for that era. When questioned, she dismissed them, but the screams from the attic couldn't be ignored. Neighbors broke in and uncovered her torture chamber. The stench and the horror caused some to vomit. Earlier suspicions had already been raised. A lawyer had once visited her home after a young enslaved girl fell to her death while fleeing punishment. The fire and the attic discovery confirmed the worst fears. LaLaurie had subjected enslaved men, mostly black, to unspeakable horrors to satisfy her sadistic pleasures. So, what do you think? Why isn't this dark chapter of history widely taught or acknowledged? Why doesn't the U.S. want you to know about the sexual exploitation of black male slaves by white elite women? Let us know your thoughts in the comments below. And if you'd like to see more content like this, please support the Black History Archives by subscribing and hitting the bell icon. Check out more of our videos to explore the untold history of Black America.